Okay, so welcome back. This will be the second lecture of the two I'm going to present on lipids. Um, so we'll go ahead, if we can remember last time, we talked about adipogenesis, the creation of adipocytes or fat cells. We also discussed lipogenesis at some fairly good depth, specifically talking about de novo fatty acid synthesis, or how those adipocytes or liver cells, depending on what species we're in, actually create fatty acids to deposit within those lipid droplets. I did notice that I spoke pretty quick in that last lecture and just started this one the same way, so I'll do a little bit better job if I can, uh, slowing down so that y'all have a greater amount of time to write everything down. So this time we're going to discuss a little bit about whole animal adipose growth, how that animal actually deposits the fat that it's making or it's eating. We'll look at how that fat that is deposited, how it affects meat, how it affects palatability in terms of tenderness, um, juiciness, etc. We're also going to jump up and look at some nutritive effects, or how nutrition, how dietary fatty acids actually affect the composition, the fatty acid profile of meat, and some differences between non-ruminants and ruminants, and more specifically, how ruminants deal with fatty acids, as it's I would say very different compared to monogastrics or non-ruminants. So to start with, let's look at whole body animal adipose growth. Um, we know how the animal creates adipocytes, the steps it takes to go from that mesenchymal stem cell all the way through a mature adipocyte. We know that it can split those cells up and go through hyperplasia. It can also just fill that lipid droplet, um, increasing in size, and how diameter or radius affects the volume of that cell as well. Um, but how does that accumulate on the animal? So we can see here in a list of 1 through 6, the first through the last um, depots of adipose on an animal. So the first area to be deposited is going to be that visceral fat, the interior around, the vital organs, the lungs and heart and that sort of thing. That's where fat's going to be deposited first. It's going to be used as a lubricant. It's going to be used as a protective layer. It's going to hold things together, allow it to slide together so you don't have adhesions or anything of that nature. And this falls in line with the second portion, which is the mesenteric, and that's just lower in the body cavity. Yeah, we usually see that around the small intestine and large intestine. That's especially where that adhesion prevention occurs. Um, Third, the body will begin to deposit fat in the perirenal area, and that literally just means around the kidneys, the vital organ that is kind of exterior. There's no ribs protecting it like further up, but it is very vital to the survival, and so the animal uses adipose tissue to protect that. And these, although they're listed 1, 2, and 3, they all kind of happen fairly at the same rate, same time period of growth. Um, we really get into a new section in number 4, and that's intermuscular fat. That's going to be the fat deposited between muscles. And that's going to allow the muscles to contract differently when they go through that sliding filament portion of contraction. The intermuscular fat is going to allow those muscles to slide at various rates without rubbing on each other. After that comes subcutaneous. We think this is the first thing that comes to mind is going to be subcutaneous when we think of fat depots, because this is the fat that we can actually see when we look at an animal, whether that be a barra or steer or whatever you may have. You're really looking for that subcutaneous fat as an indicator of how much fat that animal has, because we know it happens towards the end, and it's also very easy to see visually. We also think not only inside out fat deposition as we've seen so far, but also forward to back, and top to bottom. So we know that of a key sign, say if we're looking at a steer deciding if he's ready for harvest, we're going to look at that brisket area in that front lower area and see if he's starting to deposit a lot of subcutaneous fat. If that's getting bulgy, kind of looking like he's got a bowling ball there, that's a pretty good sign he's depositing fat. We can move back and up. His shoulder blades are going to start to smooth over. His ribs are going to be covered in a nice thick layer of fat. This is going to cover all the way up over the loin as well. And then finally in the back, we can look and see what a lot of people call pones on either side of the tail head. There's a couple areas that maybe the steer, if he's really fat, starts to look like he's got a couple softballs, one on either side of that tail head. And also in the cod fat area too for those steers, where lower where the sexual genitalia would be, they actually start depositing a lot of fat there as well. But lastly, the most important depot as far as grading an animal carcass or meat carcass is going to be that intramuscular fat. That's where, especially beef carcasses, where they're going to look, and that has a direct relation to A, what the quality grade is, and therefore B, how much a producer is going to get paid for that carcass. So while we'll see it may not have direct relationship to the actual quality of that meat or the actual palatability, it has a direct relation to the USDA quality grade, and what that is how producers are paid. So that is something that they're going to hunt all day long. And intramuscular fat is that fat that is within the muscles. So it's inside each individual muscle next to those muscle fibers and muscle bundles. And this is what you've probably heard of as marbling. So just to hammer this point home on how the whole animal growth occurs in this order, we can look here right to the left. This is going to be a chart with each of those lines representing a different depot of fat. We can see that we've got subcutaneous as the dark closed circle. The open circle is going to be intermuscular. That's that fat between the muscle. Solid triangle is going to be the mesenteric, or that the intestinal fat. The intramuscular, that marbling, is going to be that solid square. Well, no, excuse me. The solid square is going to be the brisket, or that early deposition of subcutaneous, and then the open square is going to be the kidney. That the marbling, or the intramuscular, that's going to be the open triangle. So we can see here, this is your intramuscular here. The fast subcutaneous is going to be this square, and the rest of them start up here. And this is the number of adipocytes present at the age of slaughter. So this is going to represent the quantity of cells. But if we look at this, since it's a density or a number of cells per gram of tissue, this is also relating to the size or the filling. So we can see that at 11 months of age, it's pretty young. It's less than a yearling steer, so he hasn't been through a full finishing phase. He's going to have a lot of cells up here in the mesenteric, in the subcutaneous, that sort of thing. A little bit less further lower in the subcutaneous, and then the least is going to be in the intramuscular. And this is something I want to point out. This likely isn't due to the fact that The intramuscular has a whole bunch of fat in it, so the cells are bigger, but rather this is going to be because there's just less fat in that muscle. You're getting more muscle cells in that gram of tissue than you are fat cells. And then we can see that those early depositing tissues up here are going to drop rapidly over the next 4 months. And by 15 months, they're all in a lot lower quantities. And this is where you're taking just lipid cells. And so that clearly shows that those lipid cells are growing by hypertrophy at a rapid rate to a certain size before they start to level off. Now, intramuscular, however, that marbling is going to take longer, and it does achieve by that year and a quarter or so, 15 months of age, the steer has probably gone through a finishing phase of a high concentrate diet by here, and he started to increase the size, the hypertrophy, increase the deposit of fat in those cells so that there's even less number of adipocytes in a single gram of tissue in that muscle fat. Now, to look more specifically, as I said, intramuscular fat is a key portion to grading, especially in beef. Pork fat, there's not much for quality grading. It deals a lot more with color and texture. They may look at some feathering in the ribs or the deposition of fat between or on the intercostals or between the ribs. This would be similar to the ovine or lamb carcasses, where they would look at fat streaks in the flank as the primary area for grading. However, in beef, this is where we know we quality grade, almost every single carcass that comes through, especially at calf-fed plants like a Cargill or JBS or Tyson. And we can see here that USDA quality grading relies heavily on marbling. And on the left side of this table here in the center, these are all degrees of marbling. The greatest is at the top, practically devoid is going to be the least. And around here on the bottom and around to the right, we have a slight 0, a small 50, a small 0 and then a small 50, modest 0, moderate 0, slightly abundant 0, and moderately abundant 0. And maturity plays a point in this as well, but as long as we know we're hitting A with most steer and heifer carcasses we're going to grade these primarily, overwhelmingly importance on the intramuscular fat appearance at this 12th rib. Now, the texture is also going to play a factor. We can see 3 different sections of fat texture. The top is going to be fine, the bottom is going to be coarse, and there's a medium in the middle. And during my time as a USDA grader, this was an interesting thing I realized, is that we look at a lot in the science realm at the percentage of lipids in meat. And while this does closely relate to the quality grades fairly well, it's not exact, because quality grades are based on specks of marbling. When they teach you about this, they're going to say, look for a quantity. It's not just that there's a lot of fat there, but it has to be well dispersed, and fine makes it better. So if you have 3 different steaks that are all, say, 4% fat, but one of them is in 2 or 3 large globs like this coarse fat, whereas the other one has it all broken up in this finely textured marbling, that's going to grade a lot better than that coarsely marbled steak as well. So, and just to look again, like I said, this is a slight 0 from the USDA marbling card. This is going to be the lowest or the least amount of fat in that 12th rib to get a select if you're within a maturity. Now we can slide over here. You can see there's an increase in the amount, not a whole lot, but there is, and this is going to be a small 0. This is a low choice. So anytime you see choice, it has to have at least this much marbling in it. Skip over a couple and run up here then. That modest and moderate are going to be average choice and medium choice, or average and high choice, excuse me. And those are the quality amounts, the marbling degrees you have to reach in order to get, say, a certified Angus beef has to be at least modest 0. But this steak here is going to be slightly abundant, and this is going to be the bottom level of those prime steaks that you hear about that high-end restaurants love, but cattle producers only reach about 3 to 4% annually in this grade or above. Now, as I said, especially when it comes to grading, pork doesn't rely on marbling effects, but they did get to a point after the 80s and through the 90s where they wanted to lean up that pork so much, they got to where they didn't have any marbling whatsoever, no intramuscular fat or not enough, and so they were getting dry, little flavor pork loins that people didn't want to buy. So now they're back to a point where they've got a good amount. There's actually some pork chops you can get that actually do have some pretty good amount of marbling. But does that really play an effect on palatability? And Rinker and others in 2008 looked at quantity of extractable lipid. Again, especially in pork, they don't really have the marbling grades like the USDA beef does. So they just did extractable lipids, and we can see that here with sensory panel, based on the extractable lipid percent, there's a slight increase. As lipid content increases, palatability or sensory tenderness goes up. But if you look at how where all those dots are, where those sample points are, it's not very strong, because you can see that one pork chop with maybe 1.5% extractable lipid had a sensory panel tenderness of 12. But, theoretically you should increase if you go all the way up to the 7.4% lipid, but you actually decrease pretty significantly. And if you only go down to just 7%, you increase again. So, even though there is a significant value for statistical difference as lipid content increases, so does tenderness, it doesn't explain very much of the variation that we see. And this is very similar in the shear force too. This is a more scientific method, more subjective, and we can see that shear force values are actually going to be the inverse of tenderness. Tenderness is a score rating where the higher is better, where shear force, we want less force, less kilograms of pressure required to cut through that piece of meat. And so here we can see again that while it's a little bit tighter along this line, we can see that some of these values in the 1 to 2% range are actually only in the 2 kilograms, whereas we go over to maybe 7%, and there's some that do vary all the way up to almost 4 kilograms of force required to shear those muscle fibers. And so again, while there is statistical significance in this, the variation is pretty great, and it's something that marbling doesn't do a very good job of explaining. And in this bottom one, we won't cover very much in depth, but it's just the same idea. You can see very loosely correlated around that line. There is a small increase as extractable lipids increases, but the variation is huge within each of the percentage fields. So is this the case with beef then? And that's a good question, because beef, in pork we don't do that much, but in beef we lay all of our quality marbles in the one bag of marbling at that 12th rib to say this is a high quality or low quality, this is going to be a good eating experience or a poor eating experience. But really, although increases in marbling do improve shear force and tenderness and juiciness, as we saw in that pork, it's pretty small, and marbling really only explains less than 5% of the variation in palatability, such as tenderness or shear force and juiciness. So if we look at this here, we can see that this time they did break it out by marbling score. So traces is going to be a standard state. Slight is going to be a select. Small, that's going to be low choice, followed by modest and or average, and then high choice stakes as well. And we can see that statistically, traces and slight marbling, the lower quality, they are less tender as perceived by consumers. However, as we get into that choice range, small, modest, and moderate are all in choice. They're just varying degrees of choice. And so, although you do increase in quantity of marbling, you really don't see a statistical improvement in tenderness as perceived by the consumers. And this is going to be very similar here in shear force, the exact opposite, where the lower quality grades do require a little bit more shear force to cut through that muscle fiber, but and there is a difference this time between the standard and the select. Those standards specifically tend to have a very large area of ribeye, so we can usually think of that as very hypertrophic growth, large sizes of fiber, which may make it even more difficult. A little bit smaller in that slight, as well as some more marbling. But then again, within that single area of choice, not across with small or with a low choice, average choice, or high choice, there really is no statistical difference in the amount of force required to shear those fibers. And again, similarly in juiciness, we see the exact same thing, only this time the small actually is similar to the low and the high. So that upper 2/3 choice tends to be a little bit more juicy to the perception of the consumer. But if you give them a difference between low choice and upper 2/3 certified Angus beef or just a choice steak from Walmart, they're not going to be able to really tell the difference. And if you give them that choice steak that you paid an extra $2 a pound for at Walmart compared to, say, even a standard steak, as long as they're cooked similarly, you're not going to find a huge difference there as well. So now in 2012, I believe this was during his postdoc at Tech, maybe, but O'Quinn and others performed a consumer assessment of beef, and they did so just in Lubbock, Texas. But while I was first skeptic about this, reading their methods, they did say that looking at the demographics of those that they tested or asked, they were similar to all over the country. They mentioned specifically Chicago, Los Angeles, the Dakotas, and East Coast as well. And so this is a really interesting paper, and something that if you do care about this, I would highly encourage you to read. But they didn't care so much about marbling scores, but they did quality grades. And so the overall liking of a strip steak did increase as marbling score increased or as quality grade increased. But we can see they not only use the USDA scores of standard, select, low, high, and prime, low and high choice, but they also included Wagyu and Australian beef. And so we can see those parentheses right next to the treatment is the amount of fat. And we can see those Wagyu, as we would expect, have an enormous amount of fat in there. And they are just speckled with it as far as marbling, would be much greater than prime. Whereas the Australian, which is likely grass-fed, is going to fall somewhere between our standard and select. It have much less marbling, and may be tougher too, depending on how they were processed. But we can see, is looking across here, that in tenderness, same as with Wheeler in 94, there's no difference between the tenderness viewed by consumers, whether that steak had 21.6% fat all the way down to 4.7% fat. There was a difference as we dropped all the way down to select, but there was still very difference all the way from those expensive prime and Wagyu cuts to low choice. And this is similar across the board, as we can see all the way down in the select in the juiciness. As long as we've got about 3% choice, as Dr. Stelzlini covered a couple lectures ago, it's within that acceptable range. It may not be the juiciest. We can see that it's actually only about 89% juicy, whereas the Wagyu is all the way up in the 98. But like I said earlier, a couple slides ago, there's so much variation that although it does increase, there's enough variation. It's not statistically significant, because there may be someone who gets that Wagyu and says, wow, there's just so much fat, I don't like this. Or maybe the fat doesn't cook quite right, or it doesn't melt quite right. There's all kinds of different things occurring here. Similarly, this is where that preference really starts to come in with flavor. We can see that if you're buying a choice steak, it's going to be the same as prime or high choice or low choice. It doesn't really matter. Everyone's going to rate it fairly the same. But actually, Wagyu has so much fat, this is off-putting to a lot of people, especially as we move, as the consumer base moves towards a health-conscious nature. They maybe don't like so much beef flavor, so much of that fattiness. They want more protein, more lean muscle. And so they're not going to rate that as quite as high on the flavor. And this is very apparent in the overall liking, as well as that Wagyu drops equal to the second, third, and fourth flavors, where people similarly rate Australian beef with 2.29% fat with Wagyu at 21.61. So that's a key thing to keep in mind as maybe you're producing beef, or if you're working with consumers or whatever, wherever your job may take you in the future. Now, I said we were going to come back to this in that first lecture, and Dr. Stelzlini did a really good job talking about this, so I won't spend much time on this. I'll just let you look at it real quick in case you forgot. But there are 4 theories from Saville and Cross in 88 that discuss how does marbling impact tenderness. What are the different theories on why increase in marbling tends to increase the perception of tenderness? And so bite theory, we can see it decreases the bulk density. There's less resistance to the shear force. Strain theory, there's less perimycium or intermycium around those muscle fibers, so the shear force actually is applied more directly to the fibers, decreasing the force required. The lubrication theory increases the lubrication. It allows the sensation of tenderness to increase because your teeth move through that product a lot easier. And the insurance theory is the thing I like the best. Most of these consumers that maybe don't eat beef a whole lot or don't eat meat a whole lot, they just decide on special holidays like Valentine's Day or their birthday or Christmas, let's go get a really nice steak. I want a good steak, but man, they may have no idea what they're doing when it comes to charcoals and a grill. And so if they go and purchase those higher fat contents, maybe not that Wagyu at 20%, but something in the high choice or upper 2/3, that increased lipid content provides more assurance against poor preparation, in that it doesn't transfer heat as quickly as protein does. And so it may prevent overcooking, or if it does, or if they do overcook that steak, those lipids through the lubrication and bite and strain theories allow that tougher protein to still seem like it's more tender than if they had went out and maybe purchased that $4 steak from Golden Corral that was a Trace's or practically devoid standard quality steak. So with that, let's change gears a little bit, and let's look at lipid content of meat. So where does the meat get lipids? We know from that first lecture that animals can deposit fat
as triglycerides into the lipid droplet from de novo synthesis versus dietary synthesis. Now, de novo synthesis, we talked a lot about where it happens, how it happens, but what we're about to get into is food. And so, what does de novo use? Well, ruminants is going to use acetate. Acetate is one of the three main volatile fatty acids produced by fermentation. And so ruminants that are going to take all of their dietary energy, or the majority of it, because they have limited ability in the small intestine to uptake, say, free glucose, those bacteria, the microbes in the rumen, are going to break all those down to volatile fatty acids, and the acetate is going to be free in the cytoplasm. It doesn't have to come out of the mitochondria. It can go straight into de novo synthesis. The hindgut fermenters are going to use both acetate and glucose. So something like the horse, to a very limited extent the pig, and those that have cecums, but specifically the horse, if you feed them small amounts of glucose, they can survive because their small intestine will uptake that glucose before it reaches the cecum and before those bugs have a fit on that glucose, causing acidosis and, say, colic and death. But also, this is how they consume a high amount of forage, is that forage that doesn't go through breakdown of metabolism in the acidic stomach can reach the cecum, be broken down through fermentation, and release volatile fatty acids, including acetate, that will then be free to be used in de novo synthesis. Now, similar to the horse in the higher gut, non-ruminants like pigs, humans, chickens, we're going to use glucose. And how we use glucose is a little bit of biochemistry, running that glucose through glycolysis, eventually pushing that in our aerobic cells through the TCA cycle, and we'll go all the way through the electron transport chain in order to make ATP. Now, once we have enough ATP, the body will say, we can't store ATP, we don't need to keep making heat and keep making ATP, so we'll start shuttling acetate out of the mitochondria using citrate, and then once that reaches the cytoplasm, that will be a signal for that ACC and phosphorylation to occur, pushing that through de novo synthesis. But like I said, we already covered that more or less, and so now we're going to move to the dietary fatty acid side of things, and we're going to cover a bit on non-ruminants. But really, the cool thing, I think, which isn't saying much coming from ruminant nutrition and now beef cattle and beef production, I think the ruminant side of this is pretty cool. So let's start with non-ruminants first, though. So specifically in pork, but also in chicken, fatty acid depots vary in their reaction to dietary fatty acid profile in pork, but they are going to resemble the dietary fatty acids consumed. Now, the longissimus muscle, that pork loin, the pork chops, that's going to be less reactive than other depots, such as the leaf fat, which is going to be in that visceral area and in the perirenal, as well as lard, which is sub-Q. Both of those are going to more readily absorb dietary lipids. And because of this, they're going to show a greater impact of dietary lipid profile. However, the varying dietary lipid source and the time on feed does alter the lipid profile of the longissimus muscle, specifically in hogs, but also in other non-ruminants. So we can look in here from Cook and others' paper back in the late 70s and see that they've had 3-4 different types of fats: soybean oil, poultry fat, or lard, or chicken fat, as well as beef tallow as well. And we can see that you have to go to the paper to read this yourself, or trust me. The quantities here seen for myristoylic, heptadecanoic, gallylaic, linolenic, and dihomolinoleic,
so on and so forth. And they've got these tables for saturated fatty acids as well. They're going to mirror what those dietary lipid profiles were as well. Now, the difference is going to be in the quantity, because we know, like I said, the longissimus dorsi is going to be less resistant to uptake of dietary fats. So you're not going to see, it's not going to be exact replicas of the dietary based on digestibilities and based on the how the fat was deposited and whether or not it was used for energy at some point in the life. But they do mirror it to a certain extent relatively well. And we'll see that it's much greater in hogs. We can look at both Cook and others from 68 and Apple and others from 2009, but it'll be much different than that of the ruminant fatty acid profile. Now, why do I say that? Well, ruminants have this interesting little phenomenon known as biohydrogenation. This is the altering of fats in the rumen by rumen microbes, and this is more specifically the hydrogenation or the saturation of non-saturated fats in the rumen. We know you've probably heard at some point, especially recently within the past decade, that methane production is huge in beef production. There's a lot of people wanting us to focus on that, even though compared to how much cars produce and humans, it's pretty small. But it is a big area, and cattle do produce a lot of methane. And so rather than just holding on to it or burping it out, they use fatty acids as a sink for those hydrogen. So they can take something like an 18,2 molecule, and you can actually put 2 hydrogens back on there and drop it down to an 18,1. So as there are unsaturated points in that fatty acid molecule, you can add hydrogen. And we see this is a large portion of fats are actually biohydrogenated. And additionally, this is also because especially unsaturated fatty acids are actually toxic to rumen microbes. And so if we look here on the right-hand side, we can see that C18-1, 66% of that is biohydrogenated. Now, if we start with 18-2, it actually goes up to 78%. Of the C18-3 molecules, they're actually almost 90% of those don't remain by the time it gets to the small intestine. And if we look here, this is actually from Andre's paper in 2001. If we look at the dietary fatty acid composition versus the fatty acid found in the muscle, we can see that while there's very little C18, very little stearic acid in the diet, it actually increases to almost 20%, about 18%. Now, with C18-1, this also increases a little bit, but we're fairly certain that some of that is hydrogenated to 18-0. But more impressively, that C18-2, like I said, 78% of that is hydrogenated. The C18-2 goes from almost 55%, about 53%, all the way down to about 4%, because it's all hydrogenated, whether that be partially to C18-1 or fully to C18-0. And so this is where beef gets a bad rap, because a lot of people think, well, saturated fatty acids are bad, they're unhealthy, they cause clogging of arteries, so on and so forth. And this is why they have such a greater amount of saturated fatty acids within the meat, is because of this process of biohydrogenation within the rumen. But interestingly enough, something that gives us something so bad also gives us something so good, and that is conjugated linoleic acid. I'm sure you've heard about this. This is a fatty acid that was discovered as an inhibitor of mutagenesis in fried ground beef. Pariza and others in 79 were looking for mutagenic compounds in ground beef, but what they actually found was something that inhibited it. And so further research resulted in that adding CLA to mice skin, or the skin of mice, prior to treating with a carcinogen, DMBA, actually reduced the number of mice that had resultant papillomas or skin cancer. And so we go a few more years, and it's finally identified as CLA, or conjugated linoleic acid, that is a positional and geometric isomer of linoleic acid. And these come in two different major forms, major isomers of linoleic acid, and that's the cis-9 trans-11 and the trans-10 cis-12. We'll see that both of these forms, both of these isomers, play a huge role in health. This is actually started to be looked at very beneficially for human health, in that the cis-9 trans-11 isomer is that portion that was found to be anti-carcinogenic. May influence atherosclerosis, as well as diabetes and body composition in a positive manner. But current studies are suggesting that proper intake of cis-9 trans-11 CLA, they do sell supplements of this, may be anti-carcinogenic. Now, on the other hand, the trans-11 cis-12 isomer, this deals more with body composition. We've seen that in mice, it reduces the activity of delta-9 desaturase, but it also decreases lipogenesis in vitro. So that de novo synthesis that your body goes through when it has excess energy, having trans-10 cis-12 CLA isomer in the cell at that time may limit the amount of fat production that your body actually goes through. And this is the key point to this that I said. It's funny how biohydrogenation leads to a greater amount of saturated fatty acids, which we may not want in the diet for beef, but CLA is actually naturally present in all ruminant products because it is a result of biohydrogenation. And so you get some good and you get some bad out of this. Now, I know this was a little bit quicker as well, but if anyone wants to go and read some more, the marbling effects on palatability, these are both of those beef ones we covered. The first one was Wheeler and others from 94, and we just talked about the Bos Taurus results, but they also have those same graphs for Bos Indicus, which may be very interesting for some of you who may raise cattle in the South. And then T.G. O'Quinn's paper there from 2012, both of these in the Journal of Animal Science, followed by Andre, Duckett, Hunt, Pritchard, and Owen's paper from 2001. Again, biohydrogenation, most of this is going to be seen as how do certain treatments, such as high oil corn versus a grass-based diet, how does that affect the biohydrogenation? But if you search more into some of the rumen bacteria papers and microbiology, you may get some more on biohydrogenation of lipids. So with that, we'll summarize by just saying that whole animal lipid deposition, just remember, internal comes first. The body protects itself. Then it protects the muscle with intramuscular, subcutaneous, second to last, then finally intramuscular or marbling. Quality grading is a huge factor in beef production. It's based on intramuscular content of the longissimus dorsi muscle at the 12th rib. It does not do a very good job of predicting palatability, but it is something that we've developed, we've bit into, and now we're stuck with more or less, and it is how producers are paid. We also talked about the intramuscular effects on palatability. I'm sure remembering the 4 theories of bite, strain, lubrication, and insurance will all be important. And then discussed a little bit of that muscle lipid profile with the differences in ruminants versus monogastrics with biohydrogenation and CLA as well. So with that, thank you for your time. As I said earlier, if you guys have any specific questions directed for me, feel free, give me a holler through the learning community email. and I'll try my best to help you. Otherwise, I'm sure Dr. Stelzlini will fill in any gaps that I may have left huge holes with in a third lecture. So